Welcome, everyone. Hope everyone enjoyed lunch and exploring Union Station. The Office of Municipal Securities is very excited about our next speaker, Commissioner Jaime Lizarga. He has been on the commission since 2022, and we couldn't be more excited to have him. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to the Commissioner.
Thank you, Adam, for that kind introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well post-lunch and has had their post-lunch coffee. I'd also like to thank Dave Sanchez, Director of the Office of Municipal Securities, and SEC Chair Gary Gensler for convening today's conferences. To OMS staff and all of today's panelists, thank you for contributing your time and expertise. The market for municipal securities plays a critical role in U.S. capital markets and in our economy. State, city, local, tribal, and territorial governments and other jurisdictions depend on the securities they issue to finance their priorities: hospitals, roads, schools, affordable housing, and other infrastructure. A well-functioning municipal market benefits issuers through lower borrowing costs, and the public also benefits through lower project costs and fees. The municipal securities market is primarily a retail market. Of the $4 trillion in outstanding municipal bonds at the end of 2022, 40% were held by individual investors. An additional 26% were held by mutual funds. Protecting these retail investors and ensuring full and effective disclosure in a market as large, diverse, important, and complex as the municipal securities market is an important goal. As you covered in this morning's panel, President Biden signed into law the Financial Data and Transparency Act, or FDTA, which was included in the 2022 NDAA. The FDTA was designed to update the standards for data collection and dissemination by financial regulators. The goal was to make financial data more accessible and uniform, and more useful to investors and other market participants. It also requires the federal financial regulators to pursue interoperability across agencies to streamline compliance. This congressional mandate requires financial regulators to engage in a joint rulemaking to achieve these goals. The FDTA requires the SEC to consult market participants in establishing data standards for the municipal market. Constructive, consistent, and extensive engagement between the Commission, issuing jurisdictions, investors, and advocates can yield effective standards that provide more accessible and useful information to investors. Congress gave the SEC and the other federal financial regulators 2 years to develop and publish data standards through joint rulemaking. After those standards are finalized, the SEC will have up to 2 more years to issue rules for municipal securities. This means that municipal issuers and other market participants may have up to 4 years to prepare before any data standards adopted under FDTA are issued. Moreover, any SEC structured data rule will be subject to notice and comment rulemaking. I encourage all stakeholders in the municipal market, including investors, advocates, and issuers, to participate meaningfully and constructively in the rulemaking process. The FDTA allows for scaling of disclosure for smaller issuers, state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, and other relevant authorities. This flexibility may address some of the concerns about costs for smaller municipal issuers. In addition to your discussions on FDTA, it is encouraging that you have panels focused on meaningful and effective voluntary disclosures related to ESG and cybersecurity. We've seen strong demand from investors for ESG disclosures that incorporate comparability and robust metrics. In the absence of these effective disclosures, The result is inconsistency and lack of comparability. Aiming for the highest quality, most investor-useful information regarding ESG risk disclosures is good for investors and for the municipal securities market. Your perspectives on best practices for cybersecurity disclosures for municipal issuers are also important. The SEC has proposed a set of cybersecurity rules. Similar to our ESG rules, these proposed rules will not apply to municipal issuers. But there is significant overlap between the emerging cyber risks these rules are designed to address and the risks facing municipal issuers who operate in an environment where cyber incidents are growing in frequency and sophistication. Cyber attacks and data breaches can cause irreparable and irreversible damage to individuals whose personal information is compromised and/or stolen. They may also impose significant costs on municipalities. In light of this, effective disclosures regarding cybersecurity practices protect investors, ensure that an issuer's critical systems are secure, and instill confidence that issuers have taken steps to mitigate identified cyber risks. Timely disclosures to the public regarding significant cybersecurity incidents and to individuals if their personal information is compromised are also critical. Thank you again for your participation in today's conference and for your contributions to this important market.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. We all appreciated his comments and his time. Two brief comments before we shift to the third panel. First, we do have a break after the next panel, and if everyone could remember to be back promptly at 3:15 so we can make sure to hear Commissioner Peirce's comments at that time. Without further ado, introducing panel 3. Panel 3 will be moderated by Mark Elion, Senior Counsel in our Office of Municipal Securities, and they will discuss broad risks, including ESG and cybersecurity. Without further ado, Mark, please.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mark Elion, Senior Counsel at the SEC. The purpose of today's panel is to help issuers, underwriters, investors, and the market receive the best possible broad risk ESG disclosure. The panel is focused on disclosure of broad risks, which boils down to events, trends, or conditions that are of a first-time, rare, or unpredictable nature and may present material financial or operational challenges to municipal issuers. Think a pandemic, earthquakes, demographic shifts, the southern border, cyber attacks. Basically, all broad risks come from, impact, are categorized as, or addressed through environmental, social, and governance. Because the panel is focused on broad risk ESG disclosure, it will unfortunately avoid the political areas such as ESG labeling and ESG prohibitions. Now, allow me to thank and introduce the panel, which is made up of municipal finance industry experts that graciously gave much of their time. First, we have Christopher Hamill. Chris is currently a senior fellow with Municipal Market Analytics, having worked for RBC Capital Markets and its predecessor firms as a banker and longtime head of its municipal banking operations. We have Jamil Fleming, Senior Vice President at Siebert Williams Shank. He serves as the firm's sustainability specialist. While in this role, the firm has twice been awarded the Bond Buyer Deal of the Year award in the ESG category. He also assists municipal issuers with incorporating sustainability disclosure on non-ESG labeled financings. Next, we have Nikolai Sklarov. Nikolai has 3 decades of public finance experience, currently serving as Capital Finance Director of the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. He also serves as a commissioner of the California Debt and Investment Advisory Commission and is a member of the GFOA Debt Committee. Finally, we have Walter St. Ange. Walter is a partner in the Boston office of Locke Lord, LLP. He has served as bond counsel, disclosure counsel, and underwriters counsel on public finance transactions for over 40 years. Walter is also a past president of NABL. So I'm going to kick things off with my first question, and that's going to go to Nikolai. And I'm going to break my promise not to discuss labeling. So to ask Nikolai quickly to just explain ESG labeling versus ESG risk disclosure, because the internet would lead me to believe there is a lot of confusion.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. I want to thank you and the Office of Municipal Securities for the honor of joining you today, and I'm humbled to be among such distinguished colleagues. Before I begin, and Mark, you mentioned we're going to avoid politics, and I'll do the same, but still let me preface my comments by saying the comments I'm about to share are my own and not necessarily those of the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, the California Debt and Investment Advisory Commission, or the GFOA and its debt committee. So therefore freed up, let me lean for just one moment into the political aspect of this. And I think for those of us who've been in public finance for many years, it's sad to see the state of where this dialogue is, the intrusion of politics into an area which is really designed to be about facts and material information. And I think in part, we have to blame ourselves as a bond community in being imprecise in the way we talk about this topic. Our conferences, our publications tend to conflate labeling of bonds with disclosure on ESG. We conflate impact investing with ESG and disclosure. And I think being more precise in what we're intending to talk about is really important. I also think there's room for consensus around much of this topic. Hopefully, all of us can agree that sea levels, for example, are rising. We're seeing storm impacts on all our coasts, whether it's Maine and California, New York, Florida, Texas. And I think we can all agree, hopefully, that those impacts need to be disclosed, whether people are addressing them or not, whether it's the cost of the impact or the mitigation of that impact. There are other issuers, including my issuer, that have decided to go beyond that. But that's not what we're going to be talking about today. We're really going to be talking about the factual disclosures. For my issuer, our operations begin in the Sierra Nevadas in Yosemite National Park, where we draw clean water and produce clean power, and cross 7 counties and serve 2.7 million people, and end at Golden Gate National Park. So I think you would hope that we would be good stewards of the environment, and in fact, we are, part of our mission is to protect the environment. So for us, we've made the decision, starting in 2015, that we will label bonds green to articulate how we are using our proceeds to the market and the efforts that we are making. In fact, our bonds are not merely green, they're climate bonds certified. And that is reflective of policies adopted by the city, including our climate action plan that was first adopted in 2004, and our current plan, the mayor's plan from 2021, addresses net zero, addresses social and environmental justice. But those are choices that we've made, and that's not part of our discussion today. We want to really focus today on disclosure, and ESG is part of that, but it's really just a frame for how we organize some of these disclosure topics.
If I could just add to that, Nikolai, I think that distinction between labeling and the actual risks as it relates to ESG might be the single greatest takeaway from today, from my perspective. I say that because as we're kind of clearing up misconceptions, a number of states, for example, that are among the greatest opponents of ESG actually have municipalities within them that do a robust and fantastic job as it relates to resiliency and climate change mitigation. And they actually include considerable disclosure in their documents that relates to climate risk. An example of that the city of Miami Beach, in their last non-ESG labeled financing, had 6 pages of climate change, cybersecurity, and COVID relief disclosure. So I think, separating the labeling from the risk is very, very key.
I know we're not going to talk about the labeling anymore, but I do, Nikolai, just one question. As you know, a number of states have passed anti-ESG legislation, and I've looked at the Florida legislation, and I don't know if Ben is still here to comment perhaps at the end, but it does provide that the issuers are prohibited from contracting with rating agencies if their ESG assessment would have a direct and negative impact on the rating. And I'm just curious how you would view that as an issue, or if you were subject to that kind of a rule, in part because the rating process, you don't know the rating necessarily until the end of it. You've already committed to it, but you also probably have outstanding bonds already rated by a rating agency. So even if you decline to go forward with a particular rating agency in the future, they're likely to continue to rate you based on their prior ratings, regardless of what happens going forward.
I want to be careful how I address this, and with respect to the broad range of interests and politics and jurisdictions represented in our audience. I would say that bans, whether they have been from the left or from the right, and we've seen both in this arena, have served not only to disrupt the marketplace, but have actually harmed those who are imposing the bans. But I prefer not to address any specific jurisdictions.
So switching gears to disclosure, Walter, how would you recommend a client go about finding and addressing these broad risks in their disclosure?
Well, that's easy. Thank you, Mark. I appreciate to be part of the panel. And I'm going to repeat a few things that you've heard this morning because I think there are some common themes, frankly, in this area. Municipal issuers, as you know, are subject to the anti-fraud rules, which we all know means making materiality judgments based on the particular facts and circumstances of the particular issuer. And generally known information, such as climate change, you may disagree as to how severe an impact will be, but things are changing in certain places and environments for coastal communities, for example. But you have to assess all of that in the context of the individual issuer to make a judgment about what is the appropriate disclosure. And one question you could ask is simply, how likely is a particular issue or concern going to cause the current financial condition, current financial results to change materially in the future? And obviously the near-term outlook is much easier to predict or to know than longer-term effects, which are going to be inherently somewhat more speculative. And for any issue, though, it's important to look at what process or mechanisms does the issuer have for identifying material risks of any nature, whatever the particular topic is, to ensure that the proper disclosures get made. Is the process rigorous enough to identify new matters as they emerge and to ensure that whatever the topic may be, whether it's climate change, cybersecurity exposures, the impact of the recent problems in the banking sector, possible, a more near-term issue, the impact of a debt limit problem for the United States. Immigration is also having an impact in certain cities and states in this country. How are those being addressed? In other words, really, what are the disclosure controls and procedures sufficient to identify these risks and ensure that the right people who may well be aware of a lot of information on a topic are able to get that information up to the level of the disclosure team? I think if you have the right policies and procedures in place, you'll have a better opportunity to ensure that this information does become apparent. The other thing to keep in mind, and this was mentioned again this morning, the staff legal bulletin from February of 2020, which maybe was an unfortunate timing given what happened a month later when the world turned upside down, but it stressed the staff's view that all information that's reasonably expected to reach the market is subject to the anti-fraud rules. So in other words, there's a lot of information already posted on issuer websites, reports that are filed between and among different governmental units on various topics, including matters such as climate change. Many states have passed laws to require steps being taken to get to a so-called net zero emission economy within a certain time period, or reduce the emissions by some standards, and cities and towns and other governmental entities are tasked with providing reports and information on how well they are performing in meeting those goals. And so that information is already out there. The question is, do you have the internal expertise available to then assess the vulnerabilities, to what are the plans for mitigating the risk? In other words, what information do you already have internally that just needs to be brought together, assessed by the disclosure team, using Disclosure Council? Other advisors are going to be involved in that process to help sift through it and determine what's important for investors to know. And I think what we're seeing, in my experience anyway, is a shift away from not just risk disclosure, which sometimes is more, frankly, boilerplate disclaimer that the future is uncertain and things may change and results may well vary. That's certainly true, but not all that helpful. But in this area, we're seeing more specific discussion, as Jamil just mentioned, of what is being done, what plans and things have been prepared, or what programs are being put in place and identified to help address the issues, both what are the risks, what can be done to help mitigate them, and ultimately what will be needed to protect against these effects. And that may be a significant capital expenditures largely in the future, and probably will need not just resources of the individual jurisdiction that's making the disclosure, but likely will include resources from a state government, regional entities, other cities and towns, for example, and the federal government, indeed, in some cases. So I think you have that internal process to look at. And then certainly there's guidance out there that's available. I know Chris will mention this later in his presentation. The GFOA has published best practices with respect to ESG disclosures, primarily focusing on environmental and social. I think they actually did a piece in 2020, and then more recently published these, which are very useful. And the GFOA, frankly, has been, and I'm not a member of the GFOA, but they deserve credit. They've been at the forefront of providing disclosure guidance for many, many years. If you go back and look at some of the earlier SEC reports and whatnot in the 80s and 90s, some of their disclosure guidelines have been noted and recommended as sources of information that the market should look to at least help guide their own disclosure decisions.
Great, thanks. So let's jump to our first broad risk that falls under the governance part of ESG. It also seems to come up in a lot of primary disclosure. It's also been spoken about a lot today, cybersecurity. Nikolai, can you give me your thoughts on how you approach disclosure of cybersecurity?
Well, it's hard to go from a subject that is such an existential threat as climate change to cybersecurity and then say the words, this is probably the topic that keeps me up at 3 a.m. the most. But unlike some of the other risks that we have to disclose, this is a risk where there are bad actors on the other side, maybe not even in our country, who are actively trying to do harm and are learning and changing their methods. And so this is, like many of the topics we're going to talk about, a topic that is evolving even as we're talking here today. And so my hope in all of this is that we continue to educate. I think I applaud you for shouting out GFOA. GFOA has done many best practices, even beyond the ESG arena, in terms of primary disclosure, secondary market disclosure. But specifically on cyber risk, I think our awareness of this risk really manifested when the SEC published its guidance. And of course, as issuers, we're not keeping up on all of those, guidance from the SEC. But I think our bond community, and out west I would highlight Hawkins and Orrick, both put out pieces that I still refer to, even have them with me today. But those sorts of publications, the GFOA, and then of course our state organizations such as CDAC in California have provided tremendous guidance on this topic.
I would just say quickly to add on to that, the good thing about I think our industry is that the vast majority of issuers that I work with already include cybersecurity disclosure in their official statements, which is fantastic. It's important though that we remain up to date with our efforts, given how fast technology does change. I think as Ben mentioned earlier today, as he also mentioned, we have AI to deal with today. And I'd say as an example, to the extent that AI is used, let's just say for security purposes, at that point it's often collecting and processing large amounts of data. And if we're not protecting that information, there are serious privacy concerns there, right? So I think about the collection of personal information. And to the extent there's a data breach of any sort, there's concerns about identity theft, financial fraud, and things of that nature. So it's important to keep up to date with your cybersecurity as well as disclose it in those documents.
And of course, as issuers in the municipal sector, we have to grapple with the fact that first, we're dealing with lots of personal identifiable information. We all have money running through our systems. The famous bank robber, Willie Sutton, was asked why he robbed banks, and that's because that's where the money is. And in many respects, we are a target because we also happen to be slower because of our processes than the private sector and tend to have older systems. So it's really important for us to have education programs within our organizations, to have the technology people part of the disclosure process to help inform not only what has happened, but the potential risks. The challenge for us, as is often cited, is that we also don't want to create roadmaps. And so that's where the tension is in our conversations of what to disclose.
I was going to ask Jamil, what do you see, what do you want to know from an issuer about this topic specifically? And is some of it's disclosure, certainly, but also I think this is a diligence matter, knowing that there's appropriate protections or systems or protocols in place, but nothing is perfect. I mean, virtually no one wants to make an assertion such as that and just become a target just to prove you wrong. But what is it that you find most useful in terms of the disclosure in this topic?
So I think from an investor standpoint, I would say what's most useful, I think, is the if you're taking care of things. I don't think it's the how necessarily, because I think the how, as Nikolai noted, gives the roadmap. We want to be very careful to not provide information to the bad actors to allow them to kind of circumvent the system. But I think the question is, if you're taking care of things, how often are you doing so? How often are you updating it and staying up to date with those advancements and that evolution in technology?
And I think, obviously, if you've actually experienced a breach of some sort, that may well be material and require disclosure, both for the costs of remediating the breach itself, the impact on operations if there have been recent ransomware attacks that have frozen city government services or email systems and other operations, and that has an impact that ought to be disclosed. Then there's a collateral impact if personal information is breached, a potential liability for that to the extent that things happen, or the need to provide some sort of identity theft monitoring, or the sort of things that private companies often provide when they suffer a breach. But I think that's, to me, that aspect of it is the easy part of the disclosure, in the sense that you can assess what happened and describe what happened and what the costs were, because that's maybe relatively easy to determine. The harder part is the protection going forward. And as you mentioned, I think that AI presents an extraordinarily dangerous development in this area, simply because I suspect that almost all of us have our own, whatever organization we're part of, we all get almost daily reminders about how to protect our systems and avoid, phishing emails and everything. And yet, the more someone can recreate an email that does, the common warning is look for the red flags in the email, the bad grammar, the logo that doesn't quite match up with what you typically see. But if someone can use AI to create a perfectly looking email that comes from whomever, bank of so-and-so, that is going to make it more likely that a breach is going to occur. I don't know what we can do or say about that, honestly. I think that almost becomes a matter of general knowledge that it's a dangerous world out there.
Jamil, I want to stick with you. Given your role on the market side of an issuance, do you view environmental risks, extreme weather, climate change, et cetera, as economic risks?
Sure, that's a great question. I think that ESG risks have the potential to cause financial risks as well. I'll give a few examples that we've seen in the past already. You look at Hurricane Sandy in New York City in 2012, which flooded approximately 17% of the land in New York City. It also caused $19 billion worth of damage and also a loss of economic activity in the city. Think about some of our coastal towns across the country where they're affected by flooding, which can affect real estate, property taxes, insurance claims, things of that nature. Think about areas in the South primarily that are susceptible to heat waves and droughts. States like Louisiana, Texas, Florida, et cetera, where there are predictions that some of these states may have areas that are uninhabitable in 30 plus years, which sounds, insane to me, quite frankly. But a point that Walter made in one of our prior discussions was that we speak about climate change often with these kind of large-scale events, but oftentimes it's far more subtle than that. So where I live currently in New York City, I think some of the three primary climate change risks, one is extreme heat, two is inland flooding from heavy rain, and then thirdly, coastal flooding by the rise in sea level. Frankly, more people die in this country from extreme heat than any other weather-related cause. So it's not all these catastrophic events that we think of so frequently, it's something like extreme heat. And I would say, frankly, oftentimes in our communities, from a social perspective, that often affects the low income the most, marginalized communities, which in turn can have a strong toll on our healthcare systems, on our housing systems. That's another way to think about these things. So as I do speak to some of the social risks also, we saw a severe impact with COVID, most recently, which caused an increase in unemployment. It affected our travel, a lot of volatility in the financial markets. So all of these different social and environmental risks certainly can have a financial impact. There was even a study that Moody's prepared in July of last year, and it spoke to some of the ESG risks facing the Midwest states. And I think most of which are actually being affected by a population decline or stagnation. One reason for that is the outmigration of kind of the working class age, if you will, for other opportunities in other states, which also results in kind of a shrinking working age population, which affects economic diversity and development. It also causes kind of population aging, if you will, compared to other areas in the country, which can put serious pressure on kind of the government's budget in areas like education, healthcare, social services, and pensions and whatnot. So I would say absolutely ESG risks can potentially affect the financial markets in a serious way.
Chris, what are your views on how the market is treating these risks, specifically environmental, sea level, and weather?
Sure. And let me approach that question in the following fashion, just looking at the pricing of municipal debt. Within the last week or so, there was a thoughtful piece in the Wall Street Journal about the circumstances in North Fork, Virginia, highly rated credit. And we looked at that circumstance, which fully discussed extreme weather related to climate change and what the challenges of that municipality was. And then we looked at its debt program and how its debt is pricing against other highly rated credits. For example, we looked at how it compares to the state of Washington, a very highly rated credit as well. And we see little, if any, pricing differential for issuers with greater exposure to extreme weather than those that may have less exposure to extreme weather. And so our observation is there's little, if any, extreme weather penalty being priced into the municipal market. I want to make an observation and kind of pick up on a theme of my colleagues on the panel. I'm trying in the future to expunge from my language the words climate change. I think it's an amorphous term. It has something to do with the future. There's a political debate about it. I think we as municipal professionals are in the risk business, and risk relates to extreme weather. So going forward, I'm going to do my very best to talk about extreme weather and not use those two words which start with C's. And I think that's because there is a lot of information out there, geographically specific, about extreme weather. And my concern is that that data makes its way into the process of due diligence as it relates to the offering of municipal securities. And I'll just cite a couple of very specific examples away from the fact that you probably should be Googling extreme weather related to the geography on which you're working on a transaction. But extreme weather risk considerations are available by zip code and QSIP. There is a federal agency called FEMA, which has information available for free. And you simply need to go to it and type in a zip code, and it will give you a report on, I believe it's 12 different extreme weather circumstances for that given geography. I can't say here that that information is material to your particular transaction as it relates to whatever disclosure may or may not be appropriate. I would submit, however, that it would be a useful part of the diligence process. And I'll be the third person who references it. I commend the GFOA for advancing best practices. And by my way of viewing it, as someone who used to be a Series 24 in the municipal industry, we have a set of best practices. Secondly, we have ways to review the possibility of extreme risk. For example, the FEMA site that I previously mentioned. And I think those two tools need to be embedded into the procedures of municipal departments as they're executing transactions on behalf of their issuer clients.
Chris, what do you make of your statement that you didn't see any pricing differential? What does that tell us?
Look, I think that's an excellent question. I mean, spot on. The short answer is I don't know. The longer answer is it could reflect a underappreciation for what risk may relate to extreme weather, even though in the case of North Fork, and I'm not the lawyer here, I'm the banker, I thought North Fork's disclosure was fulsome and adequate in terms of the circumstances. It may also mean, and again, I like the North Fork example and commend this Wall Street Journal article to you all to read. They've actually spent about $3.5 billion on resilience activities, a combination of federal money and municipal bond money to respond to their extreme weather risk. And and create resilience so that their community can continue to operate. You may or may not know, North Fork is the home, so the world's, not the United States, the world's largest naval base. So there's a lot of interest in seeing that geography, that city continues to operate in a fashion that's not only important to the citizenry of that city, but, the security of the nation, given the world's largest naval base is there.
I don't think I would conclude that the fact that there isn't a pricing differential means that it doesn't alter the total mix of information and therefore isn't material information. I think you may be right that it's more of a possibly, I'm speculating entirely here, more of a short-term focus and less of a real appreciation of the longer-term risks of what happens if things aren't addressed, really. And I mean, it may be that, yes, certain impacts of this will really, if nothing is done in a particular jurisdiction, it'll be 50, 60, 75 years before the real damage is fully apparent. But nonetheless, I would be loath to say to a client, oh, don't worry, this issue is not material because nobody prices it differently.
And if I said that,
No, you didn't.
I
You didn't.
apologize. I actually am headed in the other direction, which is the point is, through the last couple of decades, climate change was a scientific concept as to how the environment was going to change and produce consequences negative for our society. I think we've moved to the point where those consequences are observable. And that is why I'm trying to talk about extreme weather and not the CC word, that extreme weather is observable now, and there are various public sources of information, geographically specific, which if I were still a banker and a manager, I would say my procedures of my department would include reviewing that data and discussing it with the issuer as its materiality in the form of a municipal securities offering. Is that a best practices we might be able to agree on?
Well, I think you have to, each issuer has to make their materiality judgment with their disclosure team. I don't want to.
Agree with that?
But I think I'd almost ask for a show of hands, just how many issuers, counsel in the audience here, include now a specific section on this. We can all perhaps argue about is it enough disclosure, is it the right disclosure, but a specific section that addresses these types of issues, whether it's environmental, I see energy-related matters are also often put into that discussion in a couple of cases I'm aware of, as well as cybersecurity topic is specifically discussed now. Is that, I'm just curious, is that a more common practice today than it was? I think that's certainly true, but I think it's becoming much more prevalent.
Yeah, on your last question, for us, it is something that appears throughout our disclosure. It's how we're doing our capital projects. It's how it affects our operations. But Chris, I appreciate the point you're making and hoping to find common ground with all sides to find a way to disclose important information. I'm not ready to take the no CC pledge because I do think it's important to remember that climate change and climate change risk is more than just bad weather. It is changing the way agriculture functions in parts of our country. It's changing many things that go beyond just a bad storm. So I do think we need to think a little more comprehensively about how we capture all of those impacts.
I appreciate the point. My observation about using the words climate change is an attempt to get away from a potentially politically controversial term and just deal with what we as professionals are supposed to deal with, which is risk disclosure. I'll just signal how the world is evolving. This isn't in my notes. It just keeps popping up in my search for information related to this general topic. The insurance, there's been 4 or 5 articles in the last week, you can Google this, on the spiking of insurance rates for homes in the United States. Now, what is that saying to our market? And I think that's the kind of phenomenon. And I invite you to search out that information and read it for yourself. Insurance companies who provide home insurance are rapidly increasing their rates. What does that mean for our market? And what does that mean for how we should think about our market if an insurance industry is concerned enough about extreme weather that they are, in multiple cases, increasing their rates by double digits? And what is the implication for that in terms of the issuance of municipal bonds?
And just before we leave the topic of market appreciation, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the rating agencies who are paying increased attention to the ESG space. I think on the topic of misconceptions, once again, even though they are factoring in the environmental and the social a bit more and analyzing that more than they used to, they've kind of always looked at governance, quite frankly. You have statements from agencies such as Moody's that have said that these ESG considerations are having a low to neutral impact on their credit scores, quite frankly. Fitch came out with a report that said that probably 7% of their credit ratings are even impacted by ESG factors. Now, I've already noted in my prior response how there can be financial materiality related to these environmental and social risks, but quite frankly, at this time, those considerations are having a very, very minimal impact on the rating agency decision-making.
So, Chris, I want to ask Walter's question to the crowd about an environmental matters section to you specifically. So if these environmental risks are economic risks and have large costs, do you think that it would be helpful for investors if issuers included an environmental matters section, where relevant, obviously, in their documents to avoid missing material disclosures? And I want Walter to follow up with maybe a discussion on the importance of making particularized disclosures rather than just boilerplate.
Okay. I want to give an answer that Walter would agree with. If it's material, it's supposed to be in the OS. If it's not material, it doesn't have to be in the OS, but maybe an issuer and the lawyers and bankers should be thinking about it. And that's the challenge of where we're headed on extreme weather. This isn't a one and done moment. The SEC could have this meeting every year to discuss extreme weather risks, and frankly, probably should. That's defining our lives for the next 20 years. And I like to reference how long the time frame is, but I also want to emphasize, as I've said, extreme weather risk is apparent today. So if it is material, it is supposed to be in the offering document. In that context, and I want Walter to correct me if I misstep because I was just a dumb banker, not a lawyer. Within that context, I think our industry needs to be much more alert than it is today, monitoring these circumstances, looking at the available information on climate, on extreme weather, and making sure that is the subject of a diligence session with their client so that collectively, the team can determine whether it's material. But to have a offering document session and not reference the potential risk of extreme weather, to me, is something that shouldn't occur very much going forward. Okay, correct me.
I largely agree with you. Look, obviously the minimum test for a disclosure document is to meet the legal obligation. That's goes without saying. The real question is, as you said, what do you do to go beyond that to just better market your bonds, to be seen as a better credit and one that investors are going to have confidence in, and that the issuer has a good reputation. It goes to the topic that was discussed this morning about voluntary disclosure. Those who provide voluntary disclosure on a regular basis, I think in general, they may not be able to quantify it in terms of the pricing of their next bond issue, but in general are probably going to be seen more favorably by their investors and rating agencies and others than those who don't. And in part because some of it is simply avoiding surprises. Rating agencies, certainly. You know, sometimes I had an issue for a client a number of years ago involving a challenge to a state law it was a constitutional challenge that ultimately got settled, but it would have had a very material impact on the state budget had it not been settled. And we made a voluntary disclosure because it was too important not to, and it wasn't going to make sense to let it see how it resolved and then disclose it at the next offering. It just wasn't the way to do it. And everyone agreed this is the thing to do, and it helped keeping the rating agencies informed as it developed, avoided what could have been a more serious problem. I think here, you know, it's a similar issue, though, in any of these topics, whether it's extreme weather, the impacts of other social change. I mean, the other issues that we've discussed as we prepared for this include the issue of affordable housing, workforce housing. That's becoming a common topic. In Massachusetts, we've done a number of financings for individual communities for workforce housing, particularly for summer areas that have a lot of summer tourists, but the businesses can't get the workers. They can't afford to live near where they're supposed to work, and what can be done to address that. Some of these topics are all things which are being addressed, and I think it's the disclosure. It's not so much that it's a recent development or not. It's always been there. I mean, certain areas of the country have always been relatively high housing costs. That's just the nature of what it's been. But is it getting worse? As I said earlier, I think one way to look at these issues are what's changing. Are these situations getting more severe, creating more pressure, creating the economic pressures? And these are all things which I don't think disclosure documents in general get into the sort of macroeconomic impacts necessarily of changes in some of the demographic information is provided about the aging of the population and all, and we're seeing in how the post-COVID pandemic work patterns and living patterns will play out may also change some of that, as we've seen some areas of the country people move to and can continue to live there and work remotely, and that's going to be just fine, and that actually changes the dynamic for where they move to, as opposed to people having previously been more in the urban areas and all. But that's another area that we're going to see change coming, and I don't know how it's going to be hard to describe that in detail until the picture gets a little clearer. But I think right now what we would want to look for is some, at least, maybe it's boilerplate, but it is a risk disclosure that these circumstances are changing, and the impact. There's been a flurry of articles recently about what's happening with commercial real estate in large cities, and the vacancies in buildings, and the likely turnover in leases, and what that means. And it's not just the individual business, the owner of that building, but it's all of the businesses that depend upon having a lot of workers downtown day in and day out, five days a week previously, and now it's less. It's maybe 60% of that if they're lucky, even if everyone's back 3 days a week. That's still not the same, and the dry cleaners and the local restaurants and all of that may be affected. And what does that mean 5 years, 10 years from now? I don't know that anyone really knows that. There can be those who have ideas, but And that's, I think, is a much harder question to try to disclose, other than the fact that these things are changing and it's going to take time to see what the real impact is.
Please.
I want to be mindful of, while we have many attorneys and practitioners in the audience, we also have many issuers around the country who are watching. And I'm as a colleague, I'm sympathetic to those who are wondering, wow, I'm not a futurist. I don't know what the next spear phishing or other cybersecurity scam will be, or what the next weather event will be in my community. But I think what's most helpful is to be able to step back and consider vulnerabilities. And in some cases, periods of success, periods of prosperity can also blind us to those vulnerabilities as economies shift, as a single employer becomes strong in a community. And those are the sorts of things that we can look to as potential risks as well.
I would just add to this by saying that sometimes the discussion of disclosure as it relates to risk and vulnerabilities, people view that as kind of a knock, maybe on the credit or security, if you will. And I think, frankly, disclosure of these topics offers opportunity to discuss your mitigation efforts, to your resiliency efforts. And you can actually spin these things positively, because oftentimes if you remain silent on these issues, investors see that and they could open the door for them to say, oh, well, maybe nothing's being done. Because at times they don't have the time to do their due diligence and dig deeper into what's actually being done. And as you noted earlier, Walter, a lot of municipalities are doing the work. They do have an Office of Sustainability that they're working on. They do produce these annual reports. They do have a website dedicated to these efforts. But oftentimes those things don't appear in the disclosure document. So I think it's important to, one, address what those risks are, but take that as an opportunity to speak to all the positive efforts that you're undertaking.
I agree, and I think it highlights again the importance of having good disclosure policies that will provide a formal process to ensure that the right disclosure is being made, that there is someone assessing what's being said about this topic on our website, buried somewhere in a page that maybe no one's noticed in a long time or whatever, but it's still out there. The question is, all right, what is being done? What should we be saying about this? And what are we looking at? What are the near-term and longer-term things which are going to affect the outlook? I think most general obligation bond issuers, for example, rarely provide much future-looking information or forward-looking information about budgets, and maybe it's the current fiscal year outlook, maybe the next fiscal year in terms of a budget proposal that's been put forward to the legislature or city council or whatever, but not longer-term projections typically. I think in a revenue bond case, it's more common. You may see more longer-term projections. Indeed, often there are consultant reports for toll roads and things which will have long-term projections in order to show the projected coverage. And that's a topic, for example, I think, Chris, you mentioned it during our conversations, the issue of a gas tax security, a bond. Well, that may have been a great idea 10 years ago when it was first issued, and more bonds have been issued since then. But now, if the government is also pushing for a change to electric vehicles, what does that mean? What's the revenue mix? Some of these transactions have a mix of transportation revenues. It's not just gasoline tax receipts, but other things, but not always. And it may not be clear what the impact will be in the future, or what decisions the government may make to replace that revenue. I think it's important to remember, though, that almost all of these governments, they're not just using these revenues to pay debt service on bonds, but they're actually funding a lot of governmental operations, which presumably they don't want to see go away either. So whatever that funding source is, it's going to have to be replaced with something, and there are jurisdictions that are beginning to experiment with that.
And I really appreciate Walter referencing another category of risks, which is this transition risk issue, as opposed to the physical risks that others, including myself, have dwelt on. we're headed to a different society over the next 10 or 20 years. It is the official policy of this administration in Washington to drive us to EV usage by 2030. So I think I did check. I think there's about $50 billion of gas tax bonds out there. At some point, gas tax is going to be much less than it is today. I'll say it that way. So we need to be thinking about what other areas of our vibrant economy may be diminished as we transition to a different economy based on a different fuel mix. I'm trying to choose my words carefully. So what will be the value of oil company assets in the future, and how are they reflected in our tax base currently, and how might that tax base be different in 5, 10, 15, or 20 years, which, just to remind what everybody knows, the debt we issue is long dated. And so I think that transition risk doesn't get enough attention, and we as an industry need to spend more time thinking about it.
Nikolai, I actually wanted to ask you a question as the issuer on our panel. Is there any specific place you may look for guidance on best practices for this ESG disclosure? Can you think of any specific approach you might follow?
Yeah, I referred to some of these already, and I think we've talked a lot about the GFOA best practices. But our state organizations in California, that would be CDAC, have also devoted a lot of attention to this. CDAC in 2020 published a report on climate change disclosure and took a look at 170 plus OSs across the state over a 3-year period, and noted the important evolution that we're going through in terms of the type of disclosure, how much disclosure we're providing, and hopefully this sort of education that we're providing here today, but through our other organizations, provides that as well. We also look, of course, to our Disclosure Council as a key source of information. I don't want to get into a debate with my friends in the legal community. There are lots of different ways of organizing teams, but my preference is to have a dedicated Disclosure Council, even apart from my bond counsel, who is there from transaction to transaction and understands the organization, gets to know the people within the organization. I think for me, one of the greatest realizations moving from an investment banking role to the other side of the table, I probably recommend that in reverse for people younger in their careers, because I would approach my investment banking a lot differently had I been an issuer first. But one of my appreciations has been how many people it takes within an organization to do disclosure properly. You know, we may casually in a financing team meeting throw out, well, you know, it'd be great if we had this percentage in a paragraph, but that may take the work of 3 or 4 people who are very far removed from bond finance, which brings up the second thing, which is creating within an organization not only the policies, but also the appreciation of what it means to be providing disclosure to the public markets.
I would also encourage folks, in addition to the outlets and resources that you just noted just now, Nikolai, encourage folks to look to their peers and to who are the market leaders in the industry. Because I think a lot can be learned by assessing what others in the industry have done. I'd say obviously it's important to look to folks that are most relevant to you, because I think a lot of these risks, as you've noted, like the climate change risks, for example, are very pertinent to certain areas and not to others. I attended a conference recently that was geared primarily towards CFOs, where they had a number of breakout sessions that allowed CFOs to speak candidly about some of their experiences and what they've learned over time, and they found it to be invaluable. So I would say if you're looking for kind of standards, GFOA best practices, absolutely, but certainly look towards your peers as well and kind of who's kind of setting the stage and who are the market leaders.
Yeah, and one of the things that came out of the CDAC report was, at the time, finding people who were a mile apart who had very different approaches to disclosing climate conditions. While we don't want people repeating the mistakes of their peers, it can be helpful just to read overlapping jurisdiction and neighboring jurisdiction OSs.
Also, it was mentioned earlier, I think the second session this morning, the value of training, disclosure training, which really goes to your point, Nikolai, about how to impress upon everybody involved, and it should be a broad group. Why it's done, what the importance of it is, and I think that helps also just as another way to help generate information moving up the chain, because people become a little more sensitive to it through the training session and maybe become aware of, wait a minute, I have a question about something. Sometimes, as you said, I think in our practice for this, the disclosure team may decide something ends up on the floor. It's not material, it doesn't need to be included, but there's a discussion about it and it's considered. And I think that again goes to having the right process to help vet these questions, rather than individuals making their own decisions based on their own experience, or worse, just simply relying on last year's document and updating that. That's a starting place, but not the ending place.
So, Jamil, you've been working in a lot of the social risks through your discretion, and that's really good because those risks require the same disclosure as environmental and cyber risks if material. Can you give me a good example of something that might surprise people is a broad risk in the social category?
Sure. I think I'd start by, as you noted, mentioning some of the more common social risks. We've highlighted some of those today. I would say public safety is a huge social risk that I know a number of my clients grapple with. I would say affordable housing, I think Walter mentioned earlier, is another social risk that I think requires disclosure in certain instances. But I think we've spoken today about how sometimes, I'm going to use the phrase, apologies, climate change can be, that climate change can be a bit more nuanced at times. It's not always the hurricanes or the earthquakes or whatnot. So can be said for the social risks as well. I think maybe a year or so ago, I came across an issuance that was for broadband internet access, which I did not look at initially as a social risk, but quite frankly, as we as society implement telecommunications, more frequently, there are areas of our country where constituents don't have access to broadband internet. And in certain instances, it can actually be impossible for them to receive consultation from a physician with an internet source that's lacking. So again, similar to climate change, some of these social risks can also be a bit more nuanced in particular as well.
Great, thanks. I know that our panel started a little early, but we actually have gone over our time, but we want to give some time for questions, so if there are any questions. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for being here.